Hey, principals, let me kind of drop something on you. I know you know already, right? Only 30% of eighth graders are reading at or above proficiency levels. That means the majority of the students, the rest entering high school, are already academically kind of vulnerable or behind. So, really thinking about literacy is so important to me, and it's no longer an elementary issue. It's now a middle school issue and it's a high school issue. So, it's crucially important, especially when we're talking about workforce readiness. So we know it's earlier than sixth grade, but kind of sixth grade is where we start to see the kind of decline, where we start to see where the future graduation outcomes and how bleak it can become. And so students who kind of fail sixth grade math or ELA, they kind of see this concern. There's this concern. And so when you add that concern plus the chronic absenteeism to the equations, schools are kind of facing this early warning alert system and indicator. So I think the question becomes, are we intervening early enough? And I know it starts way before sixth grade. Okay, so the literacy myth and the actual reality that we're seeing. So many years, education has kind of operated under this assumption that students, learn to read in the early grades in elementary school, and of course they read to learn afterwards. But, to be honest, that's not our current reality. Our students still need direct literacy instruction, especially now that texts are becoming more rigorous and more complex. The academic demands need to continue to increase. Okay, like I like to tell everybody, reading is my baby. There are three kind of forces that you kind of see as this reading cliff. So it's accelerating literacy decline in the middle schools, this unfinished learning, of course, from the pandemic, and then increase of digital distractions, especially with social media and all the AI literacy kind of that's out. And so where students can read but choose not to because reading it's hard, right? And feels frustrating. And to some people or students, it may feel kind of irrelevant, right? And so these issues compound very quickly if schools are not intentional and act intentionally when we're talking about these issues. Okay, let's talk about the reluctant reader, which we're starting to see a lot of, right? When students are struggling with reading, it often kind of shows up in multiple ways, right? They may struggle to decode, especially complex words. Maybe they lack the background knowledge, which I'm seeing a lot of. Even just thinking about what you need just to understand the text fully. And then, you're starting to see a disengagement behaviorally, right? And so what that often looks like is maybe defiance or students opting out of work. And, we see it as like this literacy frustration. Now, this slide should tell you that, it's not too late to help our babies, right? And so we're thinking about middle school. Their brains are highly adaptable, particularly in areas tied to language development and comprehension, right? So this means this intervention during middle school can still produce powerful academic gains. Then there's the elementary versus the middle school support. So in elementary school, literacy tends to be very structured, and very intentional. And so there's reading blocks, there's phonics instruction, there's specialists to support, but those supports truly, honestly disappear in middle school. And so students still need the literacy support, yet many schools assume that they already pretty much mastered those foundational skills. And then we're thinking about the content. Teachers, are they equipped to teach reading? Content teachers, right? And so I always say literacy cannot live only in the ELA classrooms alone, right? Students are reading in science, math. You cannot have anything without literacy, right? Social studies, their electives, they're still reading. But to be honest, I've been around in many schools. Many teachers just haven't been trained to teach reading strategies within their content area and what that looks like. And so I see this as a systematic issue, and so not a teacher issue. So thinking of how can we train our new teachers to really implement some of these reading strategies within their content areas. So thinking about this ladder, right? And so I really believe, this framework focuses on, how do we rebuild student relationship with reading? First, of course, we introduce text in a way that kind of feels relevant to our students. Then we help them build the comprehension that's necessary, of course, the background knowledge. And then finally, we move them forward towards motivation, independent reading habits, engagement, I think must come before the endurance. So we think of these 4 high impact literacy priorities all the time, right? And these 4 strategies kind of I think you should just implement them like now, immediately, right? And so explicit teaching, academic vocabulary, building that background knowledge, increasing the reading stamina, which I think we're struggling with right now through, structured reading time, reducing device distractions. So a lot of our schools, I know LA just pulled back from, one-to-ones in like the early literacy. So from I think K1 or K2, they pulled back on the one-to-one devices. And I think these practical shifts are necessary for kind of schools that are struggling with students' literacy efforts. So now there's the student voice and AI literacy, right? And I think you're going to say, hey, Cassandra, and this quote is, you doing too much, right? But it really reflects on how many students, or on how students feel about reading today. When working with students, when students are consistently experiencing failure, with reading, it becomes something they pretty much don't want to do. And I think it's our job as educators to restore this purpose, this confidence, and this joy for literacy. All right, everything's triangles and tiers, and so I think this multi-tiered kind of intervention strategy, we know not every student needs the same level of support. Tier 1 focuses on strong core instruction, and thinking about, what is the best instruction for all students engaged, right? What does that look like? Tier 2 talks about what our interventions do we have in place. Maybe you're doing high-dosage tutoring throughout the day through your WIN groups. Tier 3, maybe you're delivering intensive individualized support, right? These are the tiers that we all know about, right? But when we think how schools need a layer system and how sometimes our tier 1 is suffering when it comes to, support, engagement in the classroom, especially with technology and devices. So if you are interested in closing the middle school achievement gap, I think this is really important, right? This really reminds us of that improvement is possible and we need to do it now, right? When schools kind of align with strong instruction and strong interventions, looking through our attendance efforts, students can make truly rapid gains, right? And so thinking about this academic gap, it doesn't have to be permanent, right? It can be closed with intentional systems if you're willing to do it like now. All right, thank you for following me on this journey. I hope you implement like today, right? And so we're thinking of like read to graduate, right? That does resonate. And so this is the ultimate takeaway. Literacy is directly tied to graduation outcomes. I don't need to say that. I think we all know that, right? And so if we want more students to graduate and be prepared for higher ed, college, careers, life, whatever, we have to prioritize, middle school literacy now. And so the time to act is now. I think high school, we waited too late. It's today. Talk to you later. Bye.